A poor woman pays for a Hell's Angels gas, but what happens next will shake her whole town. She thought she was just helping a stranger in trouble, one small act of kindness, nothing more. But the next morning the ground starts to rumble. And when she opens her front door, 100 bikers are waiting on her porch. They say they've come to repay her kindness, but not everyone believes their story. The neighbors stare. The cops start asking questions. And beneath the roar of those engines, something darker is hiding. Who are these men really here for? And when her act of kindness turns her whole life upside down, will this woman's faith be enough to survive what's coming? Drop a comment below and share which part of the world you're tuning in from today. If you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to subscribe for more. The autumn wind whipped through Coyote Bend, sending dried leaves skittering across the cracked pavement of Main Street. Hazel Hollander's worn tennis shoes squeaked against the diner's linoleum floor as she made her final rounds, collecting empty coffee cups and wiping down tables that had seen better days. Her fingers, red and slightly swollen from 14 hours of work, gripped the damp cloth with practiced efficiency. Through the streaked windows of the Sunrise Diner, she watched the sun dip lower, painting the Arizona sky in shades of amber and rose. The sight might have been beautiful if she wasn't so worried about the stack of bills waiting at home. The electric company's final notice lay heavy in her mind, its red letters seeming to flash behind her tired eyes. "You heading out, Hazel?" called Martha from behind the counter, her gray curls bouncing as she counted out the day's receipts. "Yes, finally," Hazel replied, managing a small smile. "Eli will be wondering where I am." The mention of her son brought a familiar ache to her chest. 2 years had passed since John's death, but sometimes it felt like yesterday. Eli had changed so much since then, retreating into himself like a turtle into its shell. Her once chatty boy now spoke in muttered single words, his eyes carrying shadows no 16-year-old should have to bear. Gathering her worn purse from the break room, Hazel stepped out into the cooling air. Her old Chevy sat in the back lot, its blue paint faded to the color of an old jean jacket. The engine had been making a worrying rattle lately, another problem she couldn't afford to fix. That's when she heard it, the sharp crack of a boot against metal, and a string of colorful curses that made her wince. The sound came from the gas station next door, where a massive figure in leather stood glowering at pump number 3. The man was impossible to miss. His leather vest declared him a member of the Hells Angels Nevada chapter, covered in patches that spoke of miles and stories Hazel couldn't begin to imagine. His arms, thick as fence posts, were decorated with tattoos that disappeared beneath his shirt sleeves. But what caught her attention was the look in his eyes. Not anger, but something closer to desperation. Around her, other townspeople hurried past, giving the biker a wide berth. Mrs. Peterson from the flower shop practically ran to her car, while old Mr. Wilson made a show of crossing the street. Their whispers carried on the wind. "Trouble. Better stay away. Call the sheriff, maybe." But Hazel stood still, watching. Something in her chest tugged, an old, familiar voice that sounded suspiciously like John's. "Faith isn't just a word, Hazel girl," he used to say. "It's what you do when nobody's looking." Before she could talk herself out of it, her feet were moving. Each step toward the huge biker felt both terrifying and somehow right, like walking into a storm you knew you couldn't avoid. "Excuse me," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "Are you all right?" The man turned, and Hazel had to crane her neck to meet his eyes. Up close, he was even more intimidating. She could have fit 2 of herself in his shadow. A long scar ran down one side of his face, disappearing into his beard. "What's it to you?" he growled, but Hazel caught something else in his tone. Embarrassment, maybe. "I just..." Noticed you seem to be having trouble, she persisted. Sometimes these pumps can be finicky. He stared at her for a long moment, as if trying to figure out what her angle was. Finally, his shoulders slumped slightly. Ain't the pump, he said, voice rough as gravel. Some lowlife lifted my wallet in the last town. Can't even get enough gas to make it home. Hazel's hand went to her purse automatically, feeling the thin wallet inside. $14. All she had left until payday. $14 that was supposed to cover Eli's lunch money and at least a partial payment on the electric bill. She thought of Eli waiting at home, probably hungry and wrapped in his usual silence. She thought of the dark house that might await them both if she couldn't make that payment. Then she thought of this stranger, stranded in a hostile town as night approached. Without allowing herself another moment of doubt, she pulled out the worn leather wallet. How much do you need to get home? The biker, Tank, she would later learn was his name, stared at her as if she'd started speaking in tongues. Lady, you don't want to. How much? She repeated firmly. About $10 worth should do it, he said slowly, still watching her with disbelief. Hazel walked to the pump and inserted her card, fighting down the flutter of anxiety in her stomach. As the numbers ticked up, she felt Tank's presence behind her, massive and uncertain. Why are you doing this? He asked quietly. She thought about it as she watched the dollars climb. Because someone needs to, she finally said, and today, that someone is me. When the pump clicked off at $14, her entire wallet apparently having made the decision for her, Tank's expression had changed. The hardness was still there, but something else too, something that made him look almost vulnerable. I'll pay it forward, he said gruffly, the words coming out like they surprised even him. I swear it. Hazel just nodded, not trusting herself to speak. She watched as he mounted his motorcycle, the engine roaring to life with a sound like distant thunder. He gave her one last look, a nod that carried the weight of a bow, then rode off into the deepening dusk. Climbing into her car, Hazel sat for a moment, key in the ignition. The sun had nearly set now, painting the sky in deep oranges that reminded her of the sunsets she and John used to watch from their front porch. For the first time in months, the memory didn't bring just pain. There was something else there too, a warmth that spread through her chest like a cup of hot coffee on a cold morning. As she drove home, the rattling engine providing a familiar soundtrack, Hazel felt an unfamiliar sensation settling over her. Peace, she realized with surprise. Despite the empty wallet, despite the uncertainties ahead, she felt at peace. Perhaps faith wasn't just about believing in miracles. Maybe sometimes it was about being one, no matter how small. The Arizona desert stretched out around her, its vast emptiness somehow less lonely than before, while the orange sky above seemed to whisper that even the smallest acts of kindness could light up the darkest days. The morning sun streamed through the Sunrise Diner's windows, casting long shadows across the worn linoleum floor. Hazel tied her apron with practiced movements, already feeling the weight of curious stares from the regular customers. News traveled fast in Coyote Bend, especially when it involved one of their own talking to a Hell's Angel. I heard you were chatting up that biker yesterday, Martha, another waitress, whispered as she passed with a coffee pot. Her tone carried equal parts fascination and disapproval. Before Hazel could respond, Chuck, her boss, beckoned her to the counter. His weathered face was creased with concern beneath his paper hat. A word, Hazel? She followed him to the quiet end of the counter, away from curious ears. The morning regulars pretended not to watch, but their attention was obvious in the way conversations hushed. Word is you gave money to one of those bikers yesterday, Chuck said, keeping his voice low. That true? Hazel straightened her shoulders. He needed help with gas, that's all. You could have been robbed, Chuck insisted, shaking his head. These bikers ain't good people, Hazel. They're trouble, plain and simple. What were you thinking? I was thinking someone needed help, Hazel replied quietly but firmly. How they look shouldn't matter when it comes to helping folks in need. Chuck's frown deepened. John wouldn't want you taking risks like that. The mention of her late husband stung, but Hazel kept her composure. John taught me that faith means action, Chuck. He would have understood. Throughout the morning, similar conversations played out. Regular customers who'd known her for years offered worried advice or thinly veiled criticism. Some, like old Joe, who always ordered wheat toast with grape jelly, openly mocked her decision. Guess the widow Hollander's got more heart than sense, he announced to his breakfast companions, loud enough for her to hear. The diner was unusually quiet that day. The lunch rush never materialized, leaving Hazel to wipe already clean tables and refill half-empty sugar dispensers. Her stomach growled, reminding her that she'd worked through her lunch break, but the thought of eating made her think of Eli's empty lunch account at school. By the time her shift ended, the sun was already starting its descent, painting the desert in warm copper tones. At home, she found Eli sprawled on the couch, homework spread across the coffee table. "Hey, Mom," he mumbled, not looking up from his textbook. Hazel headed to the kitchen, taking stock of their meager pantry. "How was school today?" "Fine," came the typical teenage response. She pulled out a box of macaroni and a can of corn, a simple meal, but it would have to do. As she worked at the stove, she heard Eli shuffling papers behind her. "Need any help?" he asked, his voice closer now. "Could you set the table?" Without complaint, he moved around her in their small kitchen, getting plates and forks. The responsibility sat oddly on his 16-year-old frame, making him seem both younger and older than his years. They ate in comfortable silence, broken only by the scrape of forks against plates. "Someone at school said they saw you talking to a biker yesterday," Eli finally said, pushing corn kernels around his plate. Hazel measured her response carefully. "He needed help with gas money." Eli's fork paused mid-air. "You gave him money?" "I did." "Was that—" He hesitated. "Was that our electric bill money?" The guilt in his voice made her heart ache. "Don't you worry about that. We'll figure it out." After dinner, Eli helped clean up without being asked, gathering dishes and wiping down the table. Hazel watched him, noting how hardship had shaped him into someone more mindful of others' needs. It wasn't the way she'd wanted him to learn empathy, but she was proud of him all the same. Later, she took her coffee out to the small front porch, settling into the old wooden chair John had built years ago. The desert stretched out before her, its familiar landscape fading from purple to indigo as night approached. Stars began to appear, bright pinpricks against the darkening sky. The evening was quiet, broken only by the distant yip of coyotes and the rustle of wind through desert sage. Then, carried on the night air, she heard it, the low rumble of motorcycles somewhere in the distance. The sound made her pause, coffee cup halfway to her lips. She told herself it was nothing, probably just some locals heading home on their bikes. Still, she found herself straining to listen until the sound faded completely. Going through her nighttime routine, Hazel said her usual prayers, adding an extra request for safety, not just for herself and Eli, but for a certain stranded biker who'd promised to pay forward an act of kindness. As she climbed into bed, the desert night wrapped around the small house like a familiar blanket, and she drifted off to sleep with the echo of distant engines still in her mind. Dawn broke over Coyote Bend with streaks of pink and gold painting the sky. Hazel had just finished pouring her morning coffee when she heard it, the deep, thunderous rumble of motorcycles, growing louder by the second. This wasn't just one or two bikes passing through. This was something else entirely. Her hands trembled as she set down her coffee cup. The sound swelled until it seemed to shake the very foundations of her modest home. Eli appeared in the hallway, his eyes wide with concern. "Mom?" he asked, his voice barely audible above the growing roar. Hazel moved to her front door, her heart pounding. As she pulled it open, the sight before her made her grab the doorframe for support. Stretched down her dusty street, as far as she could see, were motorcycles, at least 100 of them. Their chrome gleamed in the early morning sun, and their riders sat proudly astride them, leather vests decorated with patches catching the light. At the head of this impressive convoy stood a familiar figure, Tank, the biker she'd helped yesterday. In his massive hands, he held a brown paper grocery sack and a bouquet of desert wildflowers, purple lupines and golden poppies gathered from the roadside. "You fed me yesterday," Tank said, a surprising gentleness in his gruff voice as he smiled. "We're here to feed you." Hazel's mouth opened, but no words came out. She stepped backward instinctively, her mind struggling to process the scene before her. The bikers began rolling into her yard, their bikes forming neat rows on her patchy lawn. The rumble of engines gradually died down, replaced by the sound of boots on gravel and the metallic clink of toolboxes being opened. Neighbors emerged from their homes, some still in bathrobes, others holding up phones to record the spectacle. Camera flashes peppered the morning air, as the entire town seemed to materialize to witness this extraordinary event. Mrs. Peterson from next door stood frozen on her porch, her morning paper forgotten in her hands. The bikers moved with surprising organization. Some headed straight for her roof, carrying ladders and supplies. Others examined her weathered fence, while another group started unloading paint and brushes. Tank approached her porch, where Hazel still stood rooted to the spot. "Ma'am," he said, holding out the wildflowers. "These ain't much, but they reminded me of your kindness." Hazel accepted the bouquet with trembling hands. I don't understand," she managed to say. Tank's weathered face softened. "Mind if we come in? Got some explaining to do?" Inside her small living room, Hazel sat in her late husband's armchair, still clutching the wildflowers. Through her windows, she could see bikers working efficiently, replacing broken shingles on her roof and measuring boards for her fence. The sound of hammering and good-natured shouting filled the air. "When I got back to my chapter last night," Tank explained, sitting carefully on her sofa, "I told them what you did. About how you helped a stranger when nobody else would look twice at him. It hit something in us." He paused, looking down at his calloused hands. "We ain't always been on the right side of things, but we know goodness when we see it. The boys decided right then. We needed to do something to repay that kindness. But this is..." Hazel gestured helplessly at the activity outside. "This is too much." "No such thing as too much good in the world, ma'am," Tank replied firmly. "Besides, we got skills that we're going to waste. Bobby out there's a licensed contractor. Mike's a master painter. We figured it was time to use our abilities for something worthwhile." Eli appeared in the doorway, his expression a mix of awe and uncertainty. Tank noticed him and stood up, extending his hand. "You must be the man of the house. Your mama's something special, kid." Eli shook his hand, standing a little straighter at being addressed as a man. "Yes, sir, she is." Throughout the day, the transformation continued. The old, patched roof was completely redone. The crooked fence was straightened and reinforced. Her faded porch received a fresh coat of paint that made it glow in the sunlight. Inside the grocery sack Tank had brought were basic supplies: bread, milk, eggs, and other essentials that brought tears to Hazel's eyes. As the afternoon wore on, the aroma of barbecue began to fill the air. Several bikers had set up grills in her backyard, and the smell of cooking meat and smoking wood drew even more onlookers. Children from the neighborhood, who had initially hidden behind their parents' legs, now watched in fascination as these leather-clad men and women worked and joked together. Hazel found herself in her kitchen, surrounded by women from the motorcycle club who insisted on helping her prepare side dishes. They shared stories and laughter, treating her like a long-lost sister. The kitchen that had felt so empty for so long now buzzed with life and warmth. As the sun began to set, her backyard had transformed into an impromptu community gathering. Paper plates loaded with barbecue were passed around, and the sound of laughter filled the cooling evening air. Even some of the neighbors who had been most suspicious earlier had joined in, won over by the genuine spirit of goodwill that permeated the gathering. Hazel sat on her newly painted porch steps, a plate of food in her lap, watching the scene before her. Children played tag between the parked motorcycles while their parents chatted with bikers about everyday things, jobs, families, life's ups and downs. The barriers that had seemed so insurmountable yesterday had melted away in the face of simple human kindness. For the first time since John's death, she felt truly surrounded by life and hope. The emptiness that had taken up residence in her heart began to fill with something new, not replacing her loss, but existing alongside it, proof that good things could still grow in soil watered by tears. The morning sun had barely touched the horizon when the first news van pulled up outside the Sunrise Diner. Hazel was just starting her shift when she noticed the reporter and cameraman setting up their equipment near the entrance. Her hands trembled slightly as she poured coffee for her regular customers, trying to ignore the growing commotion outside. "Hazel," her boss called from the kitchen. "Channel 12 is here to talk to you, and look at this." He thrust his phone in front of her, showing a viral social media post. "Waitress helps Hell's Angel, gets 100 bikers at her door." The story had thousands of shares already. "Oh my," Hazel whispered, her cheeks flushing. "I really didn't do anything special." But special was exactly how everyone seemed to see it. Throughout the morning, more news crews arrived. The bell above the diner door chimed constantly as curious visitors streamed in, all hoping to meet the woman they'd started calling the Angel Lady. The interviewer from Channel 12, a polished woman in a bright red blazer, positioned Hazel near the window. "Just tell us what made you help him that day," she prompted, smiling encouragingly. Hazel smoothed her apron nervously. "Well, I just saw someone who needed help. That's all there was to it, really. The Lord asks us to love our neighbors, and He didn't put any conditions on that." As the day progressed, the diner filled to capacity. Customers left generous tips, and some even tried to press cash directly into her hands. "For your kindness," they'd say, though Hazel tried to refuse. Her boss finally set up a donation jar by the register, which filled surprisingly quickly. Even Mrs. Peterson, who'd always pinched her lips disapprovingly at Hazel's common manners, stopped by to shake her hand. "I may have misjudged you," she admitted stiffly. "What you did, well, it took real courage." Through it all, Hazel noticed Tank sitting quietly at the counter, nursing a cup of coffee, while others from his club mingled with the crowd, sharing stories and posing for pictures. He remained withdrawn. His shoulders hunched forward, and his eyes stayed fixed on his cup, as if trying to make himself invisible despite his imposing size. As the afternoon waned and the crowds finally began to thin, Hazel watched Tank through the window. He stood by her fence, running his hand along the fresh paint, lost in thought. She wiped her hands on her apron and stepped outside into the cooling air. "Thank you again," she said, softly, approaching him. "For everything you and your friends did yesterday, it means more than I can say." Tank's expression darkened, his weathered face creasing with something that looked like pain. "You don't know what kind of man I used to be," he muttered, still not meeting her eyes. His fingers traced a knot in the wood. "The things I've done." Hazel took a step closer, her voice gentle but firm. "Doesn't matter who you were, only who you're trying to be." Tank's head lifted slightly, and for a moment their eyes met. He gave her a small, almost imperceptible nod, then swung his leg over his motorcycle. The engine roared to life, and within moments he had disappeared into the gathering dusk. Hazel was still standing there, watching the empty road, when she heard footsteps behind her. Sheriff Dale Morrison approached, his face grave in the growing darkness. "Evening, Hazel," he said quietly, glancing up and down the street before continuing. "Need to talk to you about something." He shifted his weight uncomfortably. "That club your friend belongs to. They're under federal investigation. Pretty serious stuff. By helping them, you might have drawn some dangerous attention to yourself." The porch light clicked on automatically, casting a yellow glow around them. Hazel wrapped her arms around herself, suddenly cold despite the lingering warmth of the desert evening. The joy and warmth of the past 2 days seemed to recede, replaced by a creeping uncertainty. She stood there under the porch light, feeling the weight of the sheriff's words settle around her shoulders. Part of her wanted to run inside and lock the doors, to protect herself and Eli from whatever trouble might be coming. But another part remembered Tank's face, the pain and hope mixed in his eyes, and the way simple kindness had transformed an entire community, if only for a moment. The wind stirred the desert dust at her feet as she stood there, caught between fear and faith, watching the last traces of sunlight fade from the western sky. Dawn painted the desert sky in shades of pink and gold as Hazel pulled into the diner's parking lot. Her old car wheezed to a stop, and she sat for a moment, taking in the unusual scene before her. Where normally there'd be just a few regular customers' trucks, today the lot was packed with news vans, sleek government vehicles, and clusters of worried-looking townspeople. Through the diner's front windows, she could see her boss, Marcus, frantically wiping down tables and shooting anxious glances at the door. Hazel took a deep breath, straightened her name tag, and walked inside. The bell chimed as she entered, and every head turned her way. Among the crowd, she spotted 2 men in dark suits, federal agents, she guessed, sitting at the counter. Their faces were stern as they nursed black coffees and watched the room with sharp eyes. "Morning, everyone," Hazel said, trying to sound normal as she tied on her apron. She grabbed her notepad and pen, determined to focus on the familiar rhythm of her work. As she moved between tables, pouring coffee and taking orders, snippets of whispered conversations drifted to her ears. "Mixed up with criminals. Should have known better. Federal investigation." Mrs. Jenkins, one of her regulars, caught her arm as she passed. "Honey, are you sure you're safe? Those bikers, they're dangerous people." Hazel managed a gentle smile. "They fixed my roof and painted my fence, Martha. Dangerous people don't usually do that." But even as she said it, she noticed Agent Carter Briggs watching her from his seat at the counter, his expression unreadable. He'd been writing in a small notebook all morning, occasionally speaking into his phone in hushed tones. The morning rush stretched into afternoon, and Hazel's feet ached as she carried plates of meatloaf and apple pie to demanding customers. The news crews outside kept trying to peer through the windows, their cameras flashing whenever she came into view. It was nearly 3 o'clock when the bell chimed again, and Tank walked in. Hazel almost didn't recognize him at first. He wore regular clothes instead of his leather vest, just jeans and a plain blue button-down shirt. Without his usual biker gear, he looked almost ordinary, though his massive frame and the tattoos peeking from his collar still drew stares. The diner fell silent as he made his way to a corner booth. Hazel brought him coffee without being asked, and he looked up at her with troubled eyes. "I'm sorry about all this," he said quietly, gesturing at the chaos around them. "Some of the guys, they're not happy about all the attention. Makes them nervous." He wrapped his hands around the coffee mup, his knuckles white. "I never meant to bring trouble to your door." Hazel slid into the seat across from him. "I don't regret helping you," she said firmly. "Not one bit." Tank's eyes softened for a moment, but then he glanced at Agent Briggs, who was watching them intently. "Maybe you should," he muttered, standing up. He left a $20 bill on the table and walked out, his shoulders hunched against the weight of unwanted attention. The afternoon dragged on, and finally, as the sun began to set, Marcus told Hazel to head home early. "Too much excitement for one day," he said, worry lines creasing his forehead. When Hazel pulled into her driveway, she found Eli sitting on the porch steps, homework spread around him in the golden evening light. He looked up as she approached, his face thoughtful. "Want to watch the sunset?" she asked, and he nodded, gathering his books. They sat together in the old wooden chairs Tank's friends had repaired, watching the sky turn from blue to orange to deep purple. The desert stretched out before them, peaceful and vast, making the day's chaos seem far away. "You know something, Ma?" Eli said suddenly, breaking their comfortable silence. His voice was quiet but clear. "I'm proud of you." Hazel turned to look at him, surprised. Since his father's death, Eli had grown so withdrawn, rarely sharing his feelings. "You showed me what courage looks like," he continued, staring out at the darkening horizon. "Everyone said you were crazy to help that biker, but you did it anyway, because it was right." He paused, then added softly, "Dad would have been proud too." Tears pricked at Hazel's eyes, and she reached over to squeeze her son's hand. They sat there together until the stars began to appear, twinkling like distant promises in the desert night. Later, after Eli had gone to bed, Hazel knelt beside her bed as she did every night. "Lord," she whispered, "please watch over Tank. Whatever trouble he's in, whatever his past might be, please keep him safe." She couldn't have known that at that very moment, 3 motorcycles were cruising slowly past the diner, their riders wearing rival colors. In the darkness, one of them slipped off his bike and approached the door, a can of red spray paint in his hand. The crude X he painted there gleamed wet and angry in the moonlight, a silent warning of troubles yet to come. The early morning sun cast long shadows across the diner's parking lot as Hazel pulled up in her weathered Buick. Her heart skipped when she spotted 3 motorcycles parked near the entrance, their chrome gleaming in the dawn light. Tank stood there with 2 other bikers, all of them staring at the ugly red X that marred her door. "Morning," Tank called out softly as she approached. He looked uncomfortable, shifting his weight from one boot to the other. "Found this when we rode by last night. Thought we'd come early and help clean it up." Hazel's fingers trembled slightly as she unlocked the door. "Thank you," she managed, trying to keep her voice steady. "Would you like some coffee while you work?" The shorter of Tank's companions, a man with salt and pepper hair and weathered hands, stepped forward. "Name's Doc," he said, holding up a bucket of paint and brushes. "And coffee sounds real good, ma'am." The third biker, younger with close-cropped hair that suggested military service, introduced himself as Rabbit. "We also noticed your sign's got a crack running through it," he said, pointing up at the diner's worn facade. I do carpentry work. Won't take long to fix. Inside, Hazel busied herself with starting the coffee maker and heating up the griddle. Through the window, she watched the men work, Tank and Doc carefully painting over the red mark, while Rabbit climbed a ladder to examine the sign. Their movements were precise, respectful, like men who understood the weight of making things right. The morning air filled with the aroma of coffee and bacon as Hazel prepared breakfast. She couldn't help but smile at the sight of 3 tough-looking bikers sitting at her counter, their leather vests stark against the cheerful yellow walls. My mama would have called this breaking bread, Doc said, cutting into his pancakes. Something holy about sharing a meal. People began walking past the diner, slowing to stare through the windows. Some looked worried, others curious. Old Mrs. Peterson from the flower shop actually waved, and after a moment's hesitation, Tank waved back. Hazel found herself telling them about Sunday service at First Grace, Pastor Ruth's small but vibrant congregation. "You should come," she said, surprising herself with the invitation. "Pastor Ruth gives wonderful sermons." Tank's fork paused halfway to his mouth. "Been a long time since I stepped foot in a church," he admitted. The others looked equally uncertain. "Tomorrow at 10 o'clock, Hazel said gently. "No pressure, but you'd be welcome." The next morning, Hazel sat in her usual pew, trying not to look at the door every time it opened. The church filled slowly, familiar faces, weekend tourists, and finally, just as Pastor Ruth stepped up to the pulpit, 3 leather-clad figures slipped into the back row. Pastor Ruth's eyes crinkled with warmth as she began her sermon. "Today we're talking about grace," she said, her voice filling the small space. "Not the kind that makes us polite, but the kind that changes lives. Grace is the bridge between who we were and who we could be." Hazel couldn't help glancing back. Tank sat perfectly still, his massive frame somehow looking smaller in the wooden pew. As Pastor Ruth spoke about second chances and the courage to change, Hazel saw him reach up and quickly wipe his eyes. After the final hymn, most people filed out for coffee and cookies in the fellowship hall. But Tank and his friends stayed behind, approaching Pastor Ruth almost shyly. "Need any help with those chairs?" Tank asked, gesturing to the stack of folding chairs waiting to be set up for the afternoon youth group. Pastor Ruth's face lit up. "That would be wonderful." For the next hour, the 3 bikers worked alongside church volunteers, setting up chairs, arranging tables, and even helping Mrs. Johnson with her stubborn card table that never wanted to fold right. The atmosphere shifted from cautious to comfortable, with genuine smiles and conversation flowing freely. As the sun began to set, Hazel found Tank standing alone in the parking lot, staring at the church's stained glass windows. "Thank you for coming," she said softly. Tank turned to face her, his expression open and vulnerable in a way she hadn't seen before. "You gave me back something I didn't know I'd lost," he said simply. The words hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning. Hazel understood then that sometimes the biggest miracles start with the smallest acts of kindness: a tank of gas, a shared meal, an open door to a place of worship. Sometimes Grace looked like a tough biker helping with folding chairs, finding his way back to something pure and true he'd forgotten existed. The flyers appeared first at gas stations, then spread like autumn leaves across 3 counties. Bold letters proclaimed, "Ride for Hazel, where kindness meets thunder." Tank and his brothers had designed them themselves, complete with a drawing of a motorcycle surrounded by angel wings. Within days, the sleepy streets of Coyote Bend buzzed with anticipation. Hazel found one of the flyers taped to her diner's window and had to sit down, her hand pressed to her heart. The date was set for the following Saturday, and according to Tank, bikers from all over the Southwest were planning to attend. "It's getting bigger than we thought," Tank told her one morning over coffee. "Clubs from New Mexico, California, even Utah are coming, all because they heard about what you did." Hazel shook her head, still amazed. "All this over $14 worth of gas?" "It ain't about the money," Tank said quietly. "It's about seeing good in someone society told you to fear. That changes people." The morning of the event dawned clear and cool. Hazel arrived at her diner at 5 o'clock in the morning to start preparing. She'd barely unlocked the door when she heard motorcycles approaching. To her surprise, a dozen women from her church pulled up in their cars, carrying casserole dishes and pie tins. "We're here to help," Mrs. Peterson announced, already pulling on an apron. "Can't let you feed hundreds of bikers all by yourself." By 7 o'clock, the rumble of engines filled the air. Motorcycles of every make and model began rolling into town. The parking lot overflowed, then the street, then the empty lot next door. Leather vests sporting patches from different clubs mingled peacefully, united by something bigger than their differences. Tank had set up a donation booth near the diner's entrance. "Every penny goes to the local food bank," he explained to curious onlookers. "Hazel's idea. She says if one tank of gas can do this much good, imagine what we could do with more." The day transformed into a festival. Someone brought speakers, and classic rock mixed with country music filled the air. The smell of barbecue wafted from grills that seemed to appear out of nowhere. Children darted between parked motorcycles, their faces painted with temporary tattoos, courtesy of a biker named Angel, who turned out to be an art teacher. Inside the diner, Hazel could barely keep up with orders, but she noticed something remarkable. Bikers were stepping behind the counter to help serve, wash dishes, and run food. They moved with surprising grace, treating her diner with respect that brought tears to her eyes. "Ma'am," a gruff voice called out during the lunch rush. "Got time for a break?" Tank stood by the door, holding an ice cream cone. He'd been manning the ice cream station they'd set up outside, delighting local kids who'd never seen a big, tattooed biker serve sprinkles with such careful attention. "Come see what's happening," he urged. Stepping outside, Hazel gasped. The crowd had grown even larger. Bikes lined every street as far as she could see. Families picnicked on blankets spread in the park, across the street. Local musicians had set up a small stage, playing everything from blues to gospel, but what touched her most was watching Tank interact with the children. He knelt down to their level, showing them the proper way to hold an ice cream cone, listening seriously to their stories about their own bicycles. His eyes crinkled with genuine joy when they laughed. "You're good with them," Hazel observed softly. Tank's smile faded slightly. "Had a daughter once," he admitted. "Lost her and her mama in an accident. Part of why I went down some dark roads. But being here, doing this..." He gestured at the festival around them. "It feels like coming back to life." As evening approached, strings of lights appeared, zigzagging across the parking lot. The music slowed to something softer. Couples began to dance, an odd but beautiful mix of leather and lace swaying under the desert sky. Tank approached Hazel, who was watching from her diner's doorway. He cleared his throat awkwardly. "Don't suppose you'd care to dance?" Hazel hesitated only a moment before taking his offered hand. They moved to the music slowly, a respectful distance between them. She noticed people smiling, taking pictures, but for once she didn't feel self-conscious. "Thank you," Tank said suddenly, "not just for the gas that day, for seeing me. Really seeing me." Hazel squeezed his hand gently. "Sometimes we all need someone to remind us who we really are." The song ended, but the magic of the moment lingered. Hazel excused herself, and walked to the edge of the parking lot. Above her, stars pierced the darkening sky like diamonds scattered on velvet. The air still hummed with music, laughter, and the occasional rumble of engines. She closed her eyes, whispering a prayer of thanks. For the first time since losing her husband, she felt truly alive again, not just existing, but living. The simple act of helping a stranger had opened a door she thought was forever closed. Around her, the festival continued. Bikers sharing stories over pie, children sleeping on their parents' shoulders, music floating on the evening breeze. And in that moment, Hazel believed, truly believed, that her life was turning around at last. The stars seemed to shine a little brighter in response to her prayer, as if heaven itself was smiling down on this unlikely gathering of souls, brought together by one small act of kindness that had grown into something beautiful and transformative. The peaceful evening shattered in an instant. Red and blue lights sliced through the darkness, accompanied by the harsh wail of sirens. Federal vehicles swarmed the festival grounds, their headlights cutting harsh shadows across shocked faces. Children began crying, couples stopped dancing, and the music died mid-song. "Federal agents, nobody move!" The command boomed through megaphones, echoing off the diner's walls. Hazel's heart nearly stopped as she watched men in dark jackets with FBI emblazoned across their backs pour out of vehicles, weapons drawn. Agent Carter Briggs emerged from the lead car, his face set in grim determination. "Tank Morrison," Briggs shouted. "You're under arrest for involvement in a violent crime across state lines." Tank stood frozen beside Hazel, his face draining of color. For a split second, their eyes met, and she saw something there. Not guilt, but resignation, as if he'd been waiting for this moment. "No." Hazel rushed forward as two agents grabbed Tank's arms. "This has to be a mistake. He's changed. He's been helping people." "Ma'am, step back," an agent warned, pushing her away. "Tank," she called out, struggling against the restraining hand. "Tell them they're wrong." But Tank couldn't answer. The agents had already cuffed him and were shoving him toward a waiting car. Camera flashes exploded from all directions. News crews that had been covering the festival now captured his arrest. The gentle man who'd been serving ice cream to children moments ago vanished into the back of a federal vehicle. "Agent Briggs!" Hazel grabbed his sleeve. "Please, you don't understand. He's not who you think he is anymore." Briggs turned, his expression cold. "Ma'am, your friend here is connected to a string of violent incidents across 3 states. Your kindness was admirable, but it was misplaced." He pulled free of her grip and strode away. The festival dissolved into chaos. Bikers roared away on their motorcycles, families hurried to their cars, and news reporters swarmed like hungry wolves. Hazel stood in the middle of it all, feeling as if the ground had disappeared beneath her feet. By morning, the story was everywhere. Her phone buzzed constantly with notifications as headlines screamed across screens. Angel Lady's biker friend arrested, Good Samaritan deceived by violent criminal, small-town kindness exploited by biker gang. The diner stood empty. Regular customers who'd praised her generosity just days before now avoided eye contact when they passed. Some crossed the street entirely rather than walk past her door. Around noon, she heard the spray paint before she saw it. Running outside, she caught 3 teenagers fleeing from her diner's front wall. There, in angry red letters, someone had written, "Biker's Lover." Hazel's hands shook as she filled a bucket with soapy water. The words blurred through her tears as she scrubbed at them, each stroke of the brush feeling like it was scratching away at her heart instead of paint. "Need help with that?" A quiet voice startled her. It was Eli, her son, holding another brush. "You should be in school," she managed. wiping her eyes. "Some things are more important, Ma." He dipped his brush in the bucket and started scrubbing beside her. They worked in silence, but the cruel words seemed determined to linger, ghost-like on the wall, just like the doubts that now haunted her mind. Had she been wrong? Had her faith in Tank been misplaced? That evening, after Eli went to bed, Hazel sat alone in her darkened living room. The house felt colder somehow, emptier. She pulled out the note Tank had slipped her earlier that day, just before the dancing began. The paper was already worn from her constant unfolding and refolding. "If I disappear," it read, "remember, you taught me kindness. I'll pass it on." Her tears fell onto the paper, smudging the ink. The simple words seemed to carry both a warning and a promise, as if Tank had known his past might catch up with him at any moment. Outside, a car drove past slowly, probably more gawkers hoping to catch a glimpse of the angel lady who'd been fooled by a criminal. Hazel pulled her knees to her chest, feeling smaller than she had in years. The darkness pressed in around her, filled with questions she couldn't answer and doubts she couldn't silence. But that note in her hands, something about those words kept her from completely breaking down. Tank had written them before his arrest, before chaos erupted. They weren't an apology or an excuse, but a testament to what they both believed. That kindness could change people, even if the world didn't always understand or approve. She sat there until dawn began to paint the sky, clutching that piece of paper like an anchor in a storm, wondering how something as simple as helping a stranger could lead to such joy and such pain in such a short time. The calendar on the diner's wall marked time's slow crawl. Days blended into weeks, each sunrise bringing fewer customers through Hazel's doors. The breakfast rush that once filled every booth now barely occupied 3 tables. The cheerful clinking of coffee cups had given way to uncomfortable silence, broken only by whispered conversations. Hazel wiped down the counter for the 100th time that morning, trying to keep her hands busy. Her regulars, folks who'd eaten her home-style cooking for years, now grabbed their coffee to go, avoiding her eyes. The emptiness felt heavy, like a physical weight pressing down on her shoulders. The bills piled up on her desk in the back office. Red stamps marked "past due" seemed to multiply overnight. She'd already cut back on supplies, trimmed her staff hours, and started working doubles, but it wasn't enough. The diner's income had dropped to less than half of what it was before Tank's arrest. At home, Eli grew quieter with each passing day. His shoulders hunched when he walked, as if trying to make himself invisible. One evening, she found him sitting alone in the dark. "They won't stop talking about it," he said, his voice thick with frustration. "At school, everyone whispers when I walk by. Some kids asked if you were dating a murderer." Hazel's heart ached. She sat beside him, reaching for his hand. "I'm so sorry, honey. This isn't fair to you." "It's not fair to you either, Ma." He squeezed her hand. "You just tried to help someone." The next morning, Martha Jensen, her realtor friend, stopped by the diner. "Have you thought more about selling?" she asked gently. "I could get you a decent price, even in this market." Hazel's eyes drifted to the wall behind the counter. A faded photograph hung there. Her late husband, Tom, on opening day, his arm around her waist, both of them beaming with pride. The diner had been their dream, built with savings and sweat and love. Every corner held a memory of him. "I can't," Hazel whispered, her voice catching. "This place, it's all I have left of Tom. He believed in it. In me." Martha nodded, understanding in her eyes. "Well, the offer stands if you change your mind." That evening, after closing up alone, Hazel slid into the last booth, Tom's favorite spot. The setting sun painted long shadows across the checkerboard floor. She pulled Tank's letter from her apron pocket, where she'd kept it close these past weeks. The paper had grown soft from frequent handling, its creases deep and worn. Her eyes traced his words again. They wanted me to take a deal. Said if I admitted to the Reno job, they'd drop the other charges. But I won't lie, Hazel. I've done enough wrong in my life. I won't admit to something I didn't do. You showed me what real strength looks like. You gave me faith. Don't lose yours. A tear splashed onto the paper. Hazel quickly wiped it away, careful not to smear the ink. The words blurred and refocused as she blinked back more tears. Then I won't, she whispered to the empty diner. Her voice grew stronger as she repeated it. Then I won't. Standing up, she tucked the letter safely away and grabbed her coat. The evening air had turned cool, but she barely noticed as she walked the familiar path to St. Michael's Church. The old wooden doors creaked as she slipped inside. The sanctuary was empty and quiet, lit only by the soft glow of votive candles. Her footsteps echoed on the stone floor as she made her way to the prayer alcove. Kneeling, she lit 2 candles, one for Tank, wherever he was, and one for Coyote Bend, the town that had lost its way. The tiny flames flickered, casting dancing shadows on the wall. Hazel watched them burn, remembering how Tank had sat in the back pew that Sunday, his eyes wet during the sermon about grace. She thought about how the town had celebrated her kindness, then condemned her for it. About how quick they were to forget that compassion wasn't about deserving. It was about believing in better. In the gentle candlelight, Hazel bowed her head and prayed. Not for herself, though heaven knew she needed help. She prayed for Tank to stay strong, for the truth to come out. She prayed for her son's resilience, for her neighbors' hearts to soften. Most of all, she prayed for the courage to keep believing in goodness, even when it seemed like the whole world had stopped believing in her. A month dragged by like molasses in winter. October's chill had settled over Coyote Bend, bringing shorter days and longer shadows. Hazel kept the diner running on reduced hours, serving coffee and pie to the handful of loyal customers who still dared to show their faces. Then, one crisp Tuesday morning, everything changed. She was wiping down tables when Sheriff Dale Morrison's cruiser pulled into the parking lot. Her heart jumped into her throat. These days, police visits rarely brought good news. But when he stepped inside, his weathered face bore an unfamiliar expression. Hope. "Morning, Hazel," he said, removing his hat. "Mind if I sit?" She gestured to a booth, her dish towel twisted nervously in her hands. "Coffee?" "Please." He waited until she'd poured them both a cup before continuing. "Got some news from Nevada. They arrested members of the Demon Riders last night, rival gang to the Angels, found evidence linking them to that job Tank was accused of." Hazel's hands trembled so badly she had to set her coffee down. "What are you saying, Dale?" "Tank's been cleared, completely. Those riders had it in for him, tried to frame him good, but they got sloppy, left a trail. Federal boys found security footage, witness statements, everything they needed to prove Tank was nowhere near Reno when it happened." The relief hit her like a physical wave. She pressed her hand to her mouth, tears welling up. He's free?" Dale nodded, his eyes kind. "Being released today. Thought you'd want to know first before the papers get hold of it." As if on cue, her phone buzzed. The local news alert read, "Breaking: biker tank cleared of all charges. Rival gang members arrested in Nevada heist." Within hours, the story spread through town like wildfire. Hazel heard the whispers change tone as she worked, shame replacing suspicion, regret edging out rejection. People who'd crossed the street to avoid her now couldn't quite meet her eyes. That evening, she almost didn't open the diner for dinner service. Her hands shook as she flipped the sign to "Open," remembering all the empty chairs of the past month. But she'd made it this far on faith. She wouldn't stop now. The bell above the door chimed. Hazel turned, expecting another reporter, but instead saw her son, Eli. He wasn't alone. Behind him stood Joe from the hardware store, Martha the realtor, and old Mr. Peterson, who'd been coming in for breakfast every day for 20 years. "We thought you might need help getting ready for the dinner rush," Eli said, a small smile playing at his lips. Martha held up cleaning supplies. "These windows could use a good scrub." "And these menus are looking mighty tired," Mr. Peterson added, pulling fresh ones from a box. Joe already had his toolbox out. "That wobbly table in the corner's been driving me crazy for weeks." Hazel stood frozen, overwhelmed by this simple act of kindness, the very thing she'd been preaching all along. "You don't have to." "Yes, we do," Martha cut in gently. "You were right to believe in Tank, in goodness. We forgot that for a while." As they worked, more people trickled in. Some just ordered coffee. Others left generous tips with mumbled apologies. The atmosphere wasn't exactly warm yet. There was too much healing needed for that. But it had thawed considerably. The phone rang again as they were finishing up. This time it was Dale. "Just talked to Tank," the sheriff said. "He's out. Asked me to tell you thank you. Said he might stop by when things settle down." Hazel thanked him, her voice thick with emotion. After hanging up, she looked around her diner. The windows sparkled in the setting sun. The floors gleamed. Every table was level, every menu crisp and clean. It wasn't packed like the old days, but it wasn't empty either. Eli appeared at her side, wrapping an arm around her shoulders. "You okay, Ma?" She nodded, thinking of Tank's letter, still tucked safely in her apron pocket. She'd kept her faith, just like she'd promised. And somehow, through all the darkness, that tiny spark of belief had led them back toward light. Later that night, after the last customer had gone and Eli had headed home to finish his homework, Hazel stood at the door with her keys. The street was quiet, the desert sky ablaze with stars. She turned the lock with steady hands, and for the first time in weeks, she smiled. Really smiled. Hope, she realized, was like the desert flowers that bloomed after rain. It might seem dead for a season, but it was always there, waiting beneath the surface, ready to burst forth again when conditions were right. The desert dawn painted the sky in soft pinks and golds when Hazel first heard it. That familiar rumble that had changed her life weeks ago. At first, she thought she was dreaming, but the sound grew stronger, a rolling thunder that made her windows vibrate. She rushed to pull on her robe, her heart pounding. The sound was unmistakable now. Motorcycles, dozens, no hundreds of them, their engines creating a symphony that echoed through the quiet streets of Coyote Bend. Hazel burst through her front door, not even bothering with shoes. The morning air was crisp against her skin as she stood on her porch, watching in amazement as the procession turned onto Main Street. They came like a river of chrome and leather, bike after bike, rider after rider. Leading them all was a familiar figure that made her breath catch in her throat. Tank sat tall on his motorcycle, but he looked different. Gone was the hardened exterior she'd first met at the gas pump. His face was clean-shaven, his leather vest new and gleaming in the morning light. As he drew closer, she could see a patch on his vest that read, "Faith Rider." People began emerging from their homes, drawn by the thunderous parade. Mrs. Henderson from next door stood in her bathrobe, mouth agape. The Martinez family spilled out onto their lawn, their children pointing and waving. Even old Mr. Wilson, who hadn't left his house in months, peered out through his curtains. Tank brought his bike to a stop right in front of Hazel's house. The rest of the riders, filling the street behind him. The rumble of engines died down to a purr, then silence. He dismounted with grace, and Hazel could see tears in his eyes that matched her own. "Tank," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. He crossed the distance between them in 3 long strides and wrapped her in a bear hug that lifted her off her feet. The gathered crowd burst into spontaneous applause and cheers. "Told you I'd pay it forward," he said, as he set her down, his voice gruff with feeling. "And I mean to keep that promise." Hazel wiped her eyes, taking in the sight of all the riders. Some she recognized from before, members of Tank's original chapter. Others were new faces, wearing patches from different clubs and states. They all shared the same warm smiles. "But why are there so many?" she asked, gesturing to the crowd of bikers. Tank grinned. "Word spread while I was inside, about what you did, about how you never lost faith. These folks," he waved at the assembled riders, "they wanted to be part of something good, something real." Camera flashes began popping as local news crews arrived, having gotten wind of the gathering. This time, though, there was no tension in the air, no undercurrent of scandal or suspicion. Instead, there was a feeling of celebration, of redemption. "Come on," Tank said, offering his arm. "Let's get everyone to the diner. Time to show this town what real community looks like." The procession to the diner became an impromptu parade. Children ran alongside the bikes, which now moved at a crawl. People emerged from shops and houses to join the crowd. Even Sheriff Dale appeared, tipping his hat to Tank with a respectful nod. When they reached the diner, Hazel found Eli already there, setting up tables and chairs outside to accommodate the overflow crowd. He'd arranged everything without being asked, showing an initiative that made her heart swell with pride. "Need some help, ma'am?" a biker asked, rolling up his sleeves. Others joined in, carrying tables, setting up a makeshift serving line, firing up portable grills they'd brought along. The morning transformed into a celebration unlike anything Coyote Bend had ever seen. Bikers served pancakes alongside local church ladies. Children sat on motorcycles for photos while their parents chatted with riders about family and faith. The diner's regulars shared coffee with visitors from across state lines. News crews captured it all: the laughter, the shared meals, the breaking down of barriers. This time their cameras focused on the joy instead of scandal, on redemption instead of suspicion. "Miss Hazel," a reporter from Channel 5 approached, microphone in hand, "how does it feel to see your act of kindness come full circle like this?" Hazel looked around at the scene before her. Tank helping an elderly woman to her seat, Eli showing a young biker how to work the coffee machine, townspeople and riders sharing stories over plates of eggs and toast. "It feels like a miracle," she said simply. "But maybe that's what happens when we choose faith over fear, when we remember we're all just people trying to find our way home." The reporter's eyes softened. "And Tank? What would you say to those who doubted him?" "I'd say look around," Hazel gestured to the crowd. "This is who he really is, who they all are. Sometimes people just need someone to believe in them first." Throughout the morning, Tank stayed close, helping serve food, introducing Hazel to riders who'd come from as far as Texas and Montana to be part of this day. Each one had a story about how hearing about Hazel's kindness had touched them, had made them want to be better. The celebration spilled out into the street, becoming something larger than just a breakfast gathering. It became a testament to the power of simple kindness, to the way small acts of faith could ripple outward, touching lives far beyond their origin point. Reporters interviewed locals who'd once crossed the street to avoid Tank, now admitting their prejudices with shame. They filmed bikers sharing their own stories of redemption, of finding purpose in helping others. But mostly, they captured the simple joy of a community coming together, healing its wounds through shared meals and newfound understanding. Several weeks passed, and the Sunrise Diner bloomed into something extraordinary. The fresh coat of paint gleamed in the morning sun, and a new hand-painted sign caught everyone's eye. In careful brush strokes, it proclaimed, "One small kindness can move mountains, or 100 Harleys." The words made people smile as they walked in, a reminder of how one simple act had transformed their town. Inside, the diner hummed with life. The bell above the door chimed constantly as people came and went. Veterans sharing war stories over eggs and toast, truckers stopping for a hot meal during long hauls, and bikers who'd heard about the Angel Lady and wanted to experience her kindness firsthand. Hazel moved through it all with a grace that seemed to touch everyone she served. Her laughter, once rare after her husband's death, now filled the room regularly. She knew most customers by name, and those she didn't, she welcomed like old friends. "More coffee, Jim?" she asked a Vietnam veteran who'd become a regular. His weathered face crinkled with a smile as she topped off his cup. Tank had found his own path to redemption. He now helped run a charity program for at-risk youth, teaching them motorcycle maintenance and life skills. Every few days, he'd rumble up to the diner with a new group of people, sometimes troubled teens, sometimes fellow bikers looking to change their lives. "This is where it all started," he'd tell them, gesturing around the diner. "One woman who chose to see past appearances and straight into a person's heart." His voice always carried a note of reverence when he spoke about Hazel and that first act of kindness at the gas pump. The afternoon crowd thinned as evening approached. Hazel wiped down tables and counted the day's receipts, humming softly to herself. The setting sun painted the desert in shades of amber and rose, a sight that never failed to take her breath away. After locking up, she stepped outside into the cooling air. The neon open sign clicked off behind her, and she leaned against the railing, watching the last orange light fade across the vast Arizona landscape. The moment felt peaceful, complete. The familiar rumble of Tank's motorcycle announced his arrival. He parked and joined her, carrying 2 steaming cups of coffee, a thoughtful gesture that had become their evening ritual. "Brought you your favorite," he said, handing her a cup. "French vanilla creamer, just like you like it." "Thank you," she smiled, wrapping her hands around the warm mug. They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, watching the desert transform into twilight. "You think the world's changing?" Tank asked quietly, his voice carrying both hope and uncertainty. Hazel considered the question, thinking about all that had happened since that fateful day at the gas pump. "Maybe," she replied with a soft smile. But kindness never needed the world's permission to start. Tank nodded, understanding the deeper truth in her words. They stood together as the last rays of sunlight painted the sky in deep purples and blues. In the distance, the sound of motorcycles hummed, no longer a source of fear for the town, but a reminder of how redemption could come in unexpected ways. Hazel closed her eyes and whispered a prayer of thanks for the community that had healed, for the lives that had changed, for the simple act of kindness that had started it all. Because sometimes the smallest gestures could create the biggest ripples, touching lives far beyond what anyone could imagine. The engines in the distance continued their steady rhythm, a soundtrack to a story of transformation that had only just begun. Thank you for listening. Stories connect us in the most unexpected ways. If you felt that spark today, make sure you're subscribed. I share a new one daily, and the next might change your day.